Hello, Imperfect Leaders. So sometimes when I'm listening to a podcast, I hear the host say, "This week, we're only playing part one of a two-part podcast." And I think to myself, do they really have that much good material to warrant 2 weeks? Or are they just being lazy? Most of the time, it's really because the guest does have a lot of good examples to share. And that's definitely the case this week. We've got a two-parter for you. My guest is Joe Santana. Now, you're really going to enjoy this. And not in the sense of like when my mother would say, you're going to be so happy if you got a haircut. Because really, who's going to be happy, me or you? You're going to hear about employee resource groups, ERGs, and why they're really important for any organization, especially school districts. And really, you are going to enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Joseph Santana is my guest. Joe is chairman of CDO Power Circle, an association of top DEI leaders. Joe is also the creator and host of the award-winning ERG Power Talk podcast, reaching over 300 million listeners. That is amazing. And he's also an author of many articles and books, including his latest, Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG-BRG Strategy. His work has been published in multiple languages as well. And so, Joe, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Pleasure to be here with you today, Peter.
So, Joe, this podcast, it was designed to support leader longevity. The national average for school superintendents is about 3 years. The average is less if you're a woman or a leader of color. And so when I learned about your work to support CEOs and their diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I just knew I wanted to talk to you. So let's get to it. First of all, what is an ERG and what is a BRG? And can you tell us how you support leaders in this work?
Yeah, sure. So ERGs stands for Employee Resource Group. BRG stands for Business Resource Group. And essentially what these are communities of people that share some social element of identity. So it could be women, it could be veterans, any group that shares some social identity marker and that wants to get together to do a couple of things. Sometimes what they get together to do is offer each other support in terms of being a home and a hearth in a larger organization. Other times what they do is they provide career support. So they may be there to give you an opportunity, let's say, for example, to learn a new skill that you can later on use in a larger scope job in your organization. And thirdly, which is where the BRG piece comes from, is to help people who share that social identity element to find ways to help the organization secure maybe new markets, better serve markets that are underserved. So that's essentially what these groups are. Now, the way that I help them is part of a bigger picture that I provide of support. And that is these groups tend to be the supporter of people that are known as chief diversity officers in an organization. And in order to be effective, a chief diversity officer needs to be able to have this informal team of all these different communities that are aligned with them and able to support them. So in addition to providing coaching and training to the chief diversity officers, we also provide coaching, insight, training, and development. The podcast that you referenced earlier is actually a recording of discussions I have with thought leaders. But the members of my organization have their ERG leaders sitting there in the background, and they too can then communicate and talk with and ask their own questions of these thought leaders. So it becomes a way for them to develop new skills, become more effective in leading their communities, and by virtue of that, becoming more effective in supporting their chief diversity officers and their organizations.
One of the things I was thinking about when considering an employee resource group was, how is this different from an affinity group, right? Some organizations create affinity groups so that individuals who may be a trailblazer within their building or within their department have a group of supporters who are like them or not like them, but in a way that there can be people coming together to support each other. What I think I understand is that an ERG is deeper than just an affinity group. It is about support in terms of new skills, support in terms of how to be the coalition of supporters for a chief diversity officer who often is the one person who's carrying quite a load within the organization. Does that seem to resonate?
Yeah, that's correct, Peter. So in effect, these ERGs and BRGs that we talk about today are an evolution of what was formerly called affinity groups. So initially, people, let's say, for example, two Black women found each other in the cafeteria and they realize, oh, you're in marketing and I'm in accounting, and there's only one of us in each of these departments, but there are two of us here. And then one of the women said, well, I know somebody else who's in operations. And they began to come together and they formed this affinity network, sort of a home and a hearth. Then over the years, it became clear that, you know what, we can do more than just get together and provide each other with a home and a hearth. We can actually help each other with our careers. And so it became more of this employee resource group, or a group that provided resources to employees who were part of this community. And then later on, organizations realized, you know what, we can tap into these communities to learn more about markets that share that social element of identity so that we can better meet their needs. So organizations started using them along the lines, in some cases, of like a focus group, where you could go in and talk to a group of people and get their impressions and their perspectives around your particular product or services. And that's been quite amazing, actually. There is one pharma company a couple of years ago that tapped into one of their groups to understand why members of certain demographic communities were not picking up their products and so forth. So in the pharma community, you go to the doctor, he prescribes a medication. That medication is then provided by the pharmacy, and it is, they fill the script, and there it is. It's waiting for Peter or Joe to show up and pick it up. Peter and Joe don't show up and pick it up. It goes back into inventory, and it becomes a loss for the pharma company. And of course, the person's not getting their medication. So they were trying to figure out, well, why is it that some people aren't picking up our stuff? And so they essentially started tapping into these groups that they had to learn more. And they found out things like the commercials that they were doing didn't resonate with certain communities. The places where these commercials were being placed were not shows that members of these communities watched. So they took all these different things, made little adjustments here and there to how they were marketing, how they were communicating. You know what the net result was? $1 billion in revenue for that pharma company. So, and that's certainly an outlier example. It's a big example, but there are smaller examples like that of how these groups have brought value to organizations.
Well, one of the things I imagine, and that's an excellent example in terms of just what a turnaround in terms of profit and why an ERG could be used as a focus group. I could also imagine that as a corporation is considering its diversity work, right? Not just a diversity training in terms of HR, making sure that you don't harass or things like that, but rather really going deeper into saying, how have we been socialized? How do our beliefs and our actions sometimes don't always meet each other? That they might actually be able to use those ERGs as to say, like, well, Jonita in accounting is a leader in accounting and is trusted in accounting. And so if she's a part of this work, we'll trust that this work matters, as opposed to this hierarchical sort of, the way that businesses are set up, that, oh, now I'm being told by the CDO who I've not met that I have to do this work. Why should I care?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. There is that trust factor there. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, there's a bunch of other benefits in terms of, you might have a person who in their day job is basically a doer who does a particular function, has no management, project management, or other responsibilities along that line. Within, however, that community, that ERG community, they may have the opportunity to run a particular project or a particular event. They discover skills that they have. They have an opportunity to model those skills and develop those skills. So it's not surprising that a lot of people who are formerly ERG members and BRG members end up becoming then later on greater contributors in their organization or as they move on in their career. I know a number of people who are business people today who will tell you that they actually learned a lot of the skills that they later on use in their jobs and now in businesses that they're running from their ERGs, because it gives you that opportunity in that little community where there's a measure of safety and support to model a lot of different behaviors that maybe you do not get an opportunity to model in your day job.
Joe, you wrote a book, Supercharge Your ERGs, Tips to Power Up Your ERG BRG Strategy. What is one or two important takeaways from your book?
I think the two big takeaways from the book are number one, that these groups have the potential to generate huge benefits for organizations and for their members and for their communities. And then the other is that it doesn't really take a lot of extra effort, extra time or money in order to be able to generate those benefits. It's a matter of where you focus your time and energy. And so what the book offers is, as the title implies, 18 tips of different things that you can do with your ERG that will produce these bigger results, whether it's impacting your organization, impacting your members, or impacting your community. But I think the bottom line, again, is any organization, any ERG in an organization can do this. And two, that it doesn't take a lot of extra effort to do that. It's a matter of where you put your attention.
In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension, nested patterns. And that's really the muscle of an organization's work. It speaks to the way that people behave. And inside that dimension is a term that many leaders are familiar with, a growth mindset, right? Popularized by Carol Dweck. A growth mindset challenges us to consider new realities or to challenge ideas that we once believed to be indisputable. And so I read an article that you wrote a few years ago, how to help your CEO become a leader in diversity and inclusion. And in the article, you spoke to the importance of a chief diversity officer, or as you have referenced earlier, a CDO. You spoke of their job being just one of the hardest in an organization. You spoke to their role of helping CEOs learn how to match words with actions and to not only promote diversity, but to make decisions in a space where previous actions may have limited progress for people and the organization. So everything we've been talking about really has rung true, I think. In light of some states aggressively restricting DEI work and banning books, particularly in the public schools, in an effort almost to sort of oppose what is so amazing about our nation, the fact that we're a mosaic. I wonder, what advice have you been giving leaders as they seek to match beliefs with actions?
Yeah, I think now one of the most important things, Peter, is to make sure that we keep our eyes on the signals and not the noise. And what I mean by that is that if you look at, for example, investors in organizations, either for-profit organizations or people who donate to nonprofits, in the area of the for-profit, the investors care about one thing and one thing only, and that is return on investment. And return on investment takes two forms. One, am I going to be making good dividends now? And two, is this company going to grow so that it has a growing footprint and it's going to be even more valuable tomorrow than it is today? So those are the two things there. On the donor side, it's more along the lines of, is this organization meeting its mission? And is it piloting its mission in such a way that it's responsive to all the changes that are going on around us? Those are the people that either are supplying the money to run nonprofits or are supplying the fuel for these for-profit businesses. And these people, if you look at, for example, environmental, social, and governance models that are used in the for-profit area, they're focusing on things like diversity and inclusion as one of the elements that's important to them, because they realize that the population of our country is shifting. By 2045, according to the Census Bureau, what are now considered minorities will collectively be the majority. So as they're looking at that, they're realizing that's where companies are going to have to get their employees from. That's the market that companies are going to have to sell their products and services to. And unless they are well prepared to do that effectively, they're not going to be around very long, or they're going to be struggling to compete in that new world. So that's the view of the investor when they look at a company. The view of the donor is likewise, those are the populations that, let's say, for example, take a healthcare organization. Those are the populations that are going to make up the pool from which we get our doctors and nurses and our other professionals, same thing as the other organizations. And those are the populations that we're going to have to serve in terms of providing medical care, which, again, in this particular setting. So because of that, The signals are that in order for organizations to continue to be effective today and be viable tomorrow, they have to embrace and adapt themselves to this changing world that's becoming more diverse, and both in the workforce area and in the marketplace area. The noise is the politicians and all the regressives, who, go on Twitter and all these other social media platforms, and the news organizations that act as their echo chambers. But I would say the best advice that I would give today to a CEO, and that I encourage the CDOs that I work with to give to their CDOs, is look at the signal, not the noise. The noise is just, and organizations that listen to the noise end up falling on their face. A recent example, I don't know if you're a football fan or not, but Anheuser-Busch had a commercial for Bud Light. And in that commercial, they use a spokesperson who is a well-known trans person. And there were a number of people that balked at the commercial, and some person went out there, I think it was a guy by the name of Kid Rock or whatever, and shot his Bud Light, a case of Bud Light, to show his protest. So now the company turns around and they hear that noise, they react to the noise, and they say, oh, you know what? Maybe we went too far. We want to sell beer to everyone. And what happened was they didn't win back the regressive crowd, and they lost the progressive crowd as well. So the signal is that we're moving into a world that's more diverse, more open, more accepting. And that's what leaders need to watch as they pilot their ship, not the politicians that are making noise over here. Maybe that's something that you need to bake into your strategy of how do you work around that a little bit. So
how do you anticipate the unintended consequences, or the
unintended consequences? Yeah. And how do you step around that? And how do you step around some of this noise? But the bottom line is that the signal of where we're going is loud and clear. We're moving toward a more diverse society, and that's where you're going to be getting your workforce. Those are the people that are going to be buying your products. That's what you need to listen to, not all this other noise going on around.
And if I could add some superintendent speak, I would say, and the product that we are creating is when we think about the portrait of a graduate, and we say that we're preparing children for an ever-changing and unpredictable world, but we do and can predict one thing, and that is the fact that, as you just mentioned, that there will be a majority minority, right? In terms of what was once a minority, in terms of the racial and ethnic makeup of our country, will then collectively be the majority. And so if we're really preparing children for the world that they are going to inherit, then this is why that work is super important. And I think when put into that context, school boards around the nation will recognize the importance of why this work is important, and why our teachers and our staffs and our faculties need to do this work around equity and inclusion, because they have to recognize that our children are going to inherit a world where they're going to have to negotiate and navigate very different ways that people perceive and see the world.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that, Peter, because I think that is a key point that's really important, especially in the area of education. And what world are we preparing people to live in? We are not going back into the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver era. That was then and this is now. We have to prepare people to live in the world that's in front of us, the world that we're heading into, not the world that was. And if you look at history as a teacher in this, you look back at the days in France when they threw their shoes into the machines, the saboteurs, in order to stop the machines. We still had an industrial revolution. The world still moved on, and they had to adapt. So all of these past attempts to restrain progress, like people complaining about cars in the early 1900s because they were a danger to their horses. Well, guess what? We don't have a lot of horses anymore, but we sure have a lot of cars, right? The world moves forward, and we have to prepare our children and the people around us to live in that world and to be able to be effective in that world. That's true of the individual as much as it is of the business, as much as it is of people that are educating the people that are going to be living and running and one day leading that new world.
Yes. And when I talk to executives at Boeing or State Farm, or there's a really growing mortgage company called Veterans United, they're looking for critical thinkers. They're looking for individuals who know how to collaborate, who to be on a team. They're looking for individuals who know how to empathize. You don't get that unless you've actually done some of this work that you're advocating. Joe, I'd like to ask you the question that I ask every guest who comes on this podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Well, I'll tell you, I consider myself to be an imperfect leader. And I think that anybody who is a leader, who wants to continue to be a leader and continue growing as a leader, has to take that position to some degree. Because the minute that we think that we've arrived and we're perfect, that's the end of our education. That's the end of our growth. So the way I look at myself and some of the people around me is that our role as leaders is to keep reinventing ourselves, because perfection is something that you strive for, not something that you arrive at, right? It's an illusion. You create a construct and you say, this is what I want to be. And then you get there and then you reevaluate and you say, well, you know what? There are some other things that I could be doing. And then you move from there. But I think it's really important for leaders, especially, to be able to acknowledge their own imperfection, because that leaves them open to growth. And I think that, again, that's important. As we're moving into this new world, we could see the signals that we're moving into a world that's more diverse, and it's quite fast moving and changing compared to the world that we had in the last century. But as much as we could see that, we still can't see all the little particulars that are going to be coming up and what those are going to call for in terms of our being effective leaders in that space versus what it took to be an effective leader in the space that we came from in the past.
My guest again was Joe Santana, the chairman of CDO Power Circle, and he's the creator and the host of ERG Power Talk podcast, as well as the author of Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG-BRG Strategy. Thank you so much for joining me today. School districts around the nation, around the world, they are really working hard to diversify their teacher groups. And when they achieve it, meaning like when they've recruited a more diverse faculty, for example, they just fail to have a retention plan. So employee resource groups are a super important way to build bridges, bring people in, harvest the collective wisdom so that CEOs, the superintendents, can make better and more thoughtful decisions. And so you've really given us some opportunities to think about how leaders can really think about how to leverage an ERG for the benefit of their organization, their employees, and most importantly, the children that they serve. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Peter. It was my pleasure being here.
So that's the end of part one. Tune in next week for part two of my conversation with Joe Santana. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.